Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Jens Hoffmann to you today. From Costa Rica, he was educated in New York, Berlin, and Amsterdam, where he studied stage directing, drama theory, and arts administration. But he's also lived in Rio de Janeiro, Brussels, LA, and London, where he was the director of exhibitions at the Institute of Contemporary Arts from 2003 to 2007. And now, of course, San Francisco, where he's been the director of the California College of the Arts Wattis Institute for Contemporary Arts since 2006. I was interested to make note of Sabina Breitwieser's comment on the Making Time blog that she would choose a definition for time-based art as one in which the artist, rather than the curator, has regained the leadership and the decision about how the audience is confronted with the artwork. I think if we look at Jens's practice, we can certainly make note of his work with an artist like Tino Sehgal, who has had his first solo exhibition in the United States at the Wattis continually since 2007 as an instance of working with that kind of artist. But Hoffmann, on the other hand, has also become known for unconventional exhibition formats which use timing and staging of artworks to produce highly authored shows that blur the line between the strategies of artist and curator and highlight the way any encounter with an artwork is a time-based experience. As assistant curator at New York's Guggenheim in 1998, for instance, he brought attention to a lull in the exhibition of contemporary art due to the closing of the Soho branch by organizing an exhibition in his own office called The Show Must Go On. And for the 2002 exhibition at The Project in Los Angeles called A Show That Will Show That a Show is Not Only a Show, Jens started his curatorial research on the day that the exhibition opened and allowed a cumulative process to take place as the exhibition was already had its doors open by adding artists throughout its duration. For Passengers and the exhibition formerly known as Passengers, which evolved at the Wattis from 2007 to 2009, each artist in the group show took center stage one at a time for a month within a solo exhibition in a central cube. After their tenure in this central position, they exited the show altogether so that the cast, we might say, of included artists dwindled progressively as the show went on. Hoffmann has curated over 30 exhibitions internationally since the late 90s. Rather than trying to recite a complete bio here, I've attempted just to pick out a few examples that seem particularly relevant to our topic at the symposium and to Jens's discussion today. But I'll conclude by mentioning that he was also the co-curator of the second San Juan Triennial in 2009 and was the curator with Adriana Pedrosa of the 12th International Istanbul Biennial in 2007. With Harold Fletcher, Hoffmann has developed the People's Biennial, the first edition of which was presented in 2010 and 2011 at 5 U.S. museums outside what we might consider this country's art centers. Hoffmann regularly contributes writing to a number of publications, but in 2009 he also founded The Exhibitionist, a journal for exhibition making. His most recent books include The Next Documentary Should Be Curated by an Artist, published by Revolver in 2007, and Perform, co-authored with Joan Jonas and published by Thames and Hudson in 2005. And as I understand it, another book, Showtime, is forthcoming from Thames and Hudson at the moment. And Jens's talk today will be followed by a response from Rebecca Schneider, who I know was introduced thoroughly yesterday, so I'll just repeat today that she is the chair of the Department of Theater, Speech, and Dance at Brown University. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thanks to all of you for coming, and thank you for inviting me. I want to start this lecture off by saying that a sort of a process of continuous self-reflection and analysis is, of course, key to any intellectual development. And time and space for reflection is something that curators generally have very little room for in our field today. So I was very happy to be invited to this conference to be able to consider some ideas I've been working through in my exhibitions over a number of years and to examine these exhibitions within the framework of this conference. Obviously, the question of time-based art or performance art in the museum or in curating in general is a big one. Curating performance in visual art context is becoming more and more popular. Major institutions in the US, such as the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and Europe, fronted by Tate Modern, now have performance departments collecting and archiving procedures, and their collecting and archiving procedures are changing to accommodate this development. Organizations like Performer are expanding into even wider arenas, all reflecting performance current popularity within the contemporary art world. There are now even courses devoted to learning about the specificities of curating performance within the museum and exhibition space. All this is to say that performance art as a category has been recognized and acknowledged and has become part of the general art museum-going experience, just like painting, sculpture, or photography. This is an interesting development to be sure, and one that needs to be seriously analyzed in conferences such as this one. But I think in here lies a danger for setting up false binaries for how we think about visual art and performance. There's long been a history of artists moving back and forth between performance and more traditional object-based practices that is probably longer than recorded art history. Just to take a specific instance, we can look at a number of examples from the 20th century avant-garde. At the heart of the constructivist movement was a determination to explore life between objects, people, and new mode of thinking about the world based on action rather than contemplation. Kazimir Malevich and Lity founded a collective, Unovis, that produced ballets, operas, and plays. And Lity's demonstration room and his famous abstract cabinet that were installed in the Hannoversche Landesmuseum in 1926 and 1927 in collaboration with the visionary curator Alexander Dorner, displayed two-dimensional works by the artist himself, Oskar Schlemmer, and others within a kinetic installation by which audience members could move walls and transforming their viewing environment at will. Lity famously called these rooms, and I quote, the stations where one changes from painting to architecture. Oskar Schlemmer's triadic ballet, bridge dance, and sculpture. There are many more examples of this kind of interdisciplinary creativity that I won't really get into, other than to say I strongly feel that this is how many artists have practiced in the past and how many artists continue to practice today. My point is that when we are talking about visual arts and performance, it is not necessarily a new phenomenon within artistic practice itself. I view this rather as a development within display, within collection, within categorization, and the institutionalization within the contemporary art world. It is often that case that curators seek out types of art that fit into certain preconditioned aesthetics or timely trends. When Alfred Barr, the art historian and founding director of MoMA, visited the Soviet Union in 1927, he wrote in his diary that about a studio visit with Alexander Rodchenko, and I quote, Rodchenko showed us, here's Rodchenko, they don't like each other. Alfred Barr wrote, Rodchenko showed us an appalling variety of things, suprematist paintings, woodcuts, lino cuts, posters, book design, photographs, set designs, costumes, libraries. He has not done one painting since 1922, devoting himself to the photographic arts of which he is a master. It was an excellent evening, but I must find painters if possible. Barr was on a mission to find work that will illustrate his ideal of an avant-garde art form that rested on abstract painting, and no other medium could do. And I often discover in conversations with colleagues that they are seeking out a very particular type of work as well, or sometimes even a certain type of artist for a particular exhibition. I also find that today's performance is roughly the equivalent of Barr's painting in the 1920s. A work of performance art before it's even seen or experienced in the museum or gallery is often already considered cutting edge, just based on its nature as a temporary, ephemeral, and sometimes participatory experience. Additionally, the adoption of performance within the institution is partly in response to a need to allow designated forms of interactivity within an ever-growing audience within strictly set parameters. It is no surprise that in response to the curatorial demand and the exposure it brings, that many artists would agree to start producing commissions or working in performance in ways that they might not find typical for their practice otherwise. Performer, the biennial for visual arts performance, as it's called, is the ultimate example of this process, commissioning artists who have never worked in this vein before to produce large-scale performance projects with both very brilliant, but unfortunately also very disappointing results. I feel that the conversation of performance is more complex and varied than we often consider. Many artists work with performance as part of a visual arts practice and vice versa. I do not necessarily see a distinctive trend towards an increasing relevance of performance or in art either. That relevancy has always been there. What is new is a drive to categorize or curate performance. And here are just some classic examples. How this has been, and I think here was the program of performer. I also want to preface my talk by stating the obvious. I'm a curator, I'm not a theorist, and I'm not an art historian. And even more specifically, I'm not a curator at an encyclopedic museum, and my practice has always been based on creating an experience for an audience, rather than categorizing or defining objects within particular art historical narratives. This is to say, my thinking is informed by a set of rules quite specifically within the exhibition space itself, and my practice has very much developed in consideration of what kind of experience can be made possible within that space. Today I would like to offer another mode of thinking about performance and the exhibition that is less involved with the various structures or trends of the art world and more in consideration of the experience of the exhibition and the artwork itself. I will discuss a trilogy of exhibitions that I curated at the CCA Wattis Institute for Contemporary Arts from 2008 to 2010 that took at their starting points seminal works of American literature, employing these examples to set up an alternative notion of performance that comes out of my background in theater and my interest in particular strands of critical theory, notably Herbert Marcuse. The Wizard of Oz, Moby Dick, and Huckleberry Finn are critical in considering my methodology and thoughts on the installation of the exhibition as a dramatic construction. As I just mentioned, I was trained as a theater director at the Ernst Busch School for Performing Arts in Berlin, and there I was introduced to the theory and practices of Bert Brecht and Erwin Piscator, as well as to the writings of the Frankfurter School. Therefore, I've always been interested in the idea of fostering critical and political engagement with an audience through the changing of an experience, and this has become the core of my practice to date. I was particularly influenced by Erwin Piscator's idea of the epic theater, a term that the better-known Brecht later borrowed. And it marks perhaps most importantly to me as a theater for vast audiences, as Piscator called it, a theater of action whose objective is to bring about the steering questions of our time and to bring about the total re-education of both man, of the theater, and the audience. Piscator's wife, Maria Piscator-Ley, said of his work, quote, "It was as much a political revolution as it was an aesthetic one." I want to get back to this idea of politics and aesthetics in a moment, but to sum up its most basic terms, epic theater worked towards portraying reality against fantasy or pure escapism by employing certain stage settings, acting techniques, and modes of interaction that could ideally engender the ability to raise political consciousness. Piscator was also the first director to mix media, so to speak, incorporating live theater with film. Another aspect of his practice has been relevant, which is another aspect of his practice that has been relevant to my development. Needless to say, when I became involved in the world of curating, these influences and interests came along with me. Here are some examples of Piscator's work at the Theater am Nollendorfplatz. My concept of performance or time-based practice, which I'm elaborating on today, really comes out of the idea of the exhibition as a stage set in which the objects on display are the performers. And just to be clear, I'm not necessarily talking about performance as a category of art subject to much discussion in this conference. I'm talking about the objects themselves, any medium of object in the exhibition, their relationship and juxtaposition with each other, and the meaning these create for a viewer within a highly individualized and subjective time and space. The performance element of my practice starts with the works themselves, the meaning they create with each other and with the viewer. In an ideal situation, the viewer, him or herself, then becomes the ultimate performer within this dynamic, connecting individual subjectivities and life experiences with the works in the exhibition to create new meaning. In thinking about politics and aesthetics, I would also like to bring up some of the work of Herbert Marcuse, in particular his book, The Aesthetic Dimension, which was one of his last writings and perhaps lesser-known writings published in 1978 as a critique of Marxist orthodoxy for interpreting art. While Marcuse, like Benjamin and Adorno and the rest of the Frankfurt School, holds out for the radical potential of art for impacting society at large, he takes a more inclusive approach that does not dismiss art, that does not reflect the modernization of society, as Benjamin said, nor works that do not fit into the art of the high avant-garde, as Adorno said. For Marcuse, the work of art is able to transcend that particular classic ideologies in which it was created and can exist autonomously of those societal relations. In fact, Marcuse believed that the political potential of art lies only in its own aesthetic dimension. And the sense of subversive critical thinking that work engenders is what he called estrangement. He championed the notion of beauty and form among all other categories of art, both high and low, and he cries overly political didactic work, claiming that, and quote, deprives art of the very form in which it can create that other reality within the established one, the cosmos of hope. Subjectivity is a key component in Marcuse's analysis, and it is something I'll always consider in my exhibitions, both my own subjectivity as an exhibition maker and the subjectivity of the viewer. Some may find the ideas that I just articulated perhaps a bit old-fashioned, but this is not an art for art's sake argument. It is fundamentally about developing the conditions of engendering critical consciousness through art, as well as resistance to the reduction of art for only practical ends. Subjectivity in this context can be a troubling notion, of course, and Marcuse himself acknowledged that subjectivity in itself is a capitalist bourgeois construction. At the same time, subjectivity has become so dominant in our epistemology, the way we think about the world around us, and this makes it potentially a challenging and, as Marcuse said, antagonistic force to foster social change. I do not make activist exhibition, and for some that would mean that I'm not a political curator. I would say that I'm a curator informed by a very particular political position, and my exhibitions are constructed within this framework in mind in both form and content. In terms of form, I generate what I call the exhibition as a dramatic construction through three main elements. Number one, the development of text-based exhibition and the process of dramaturgy associated with this element. My exhibitions are developed with a particular source material in mind, and everything from the objects included in the exhibition to the exhibition design and the catalog are developed in consideration to the source material. Secondly, I connect the exhibition, or I think of the exhibition as a stage set in which a narrative unfolds through elements as one walks through the exhibition. This, of course, very much relates to the source material of the three exhibitions I'm discussing, all of which incorporated journeys and rites of passage in the work. And thirdly, I incorporate archival or non-art materials in my exhibition as a means to break the narrative or viewer pleasure and create the form of estrangement and subjectivity with which Brecht and Piscator also produced in their work and which Marcuse analyzed. I started as the director of the CCA Wattis in 2007, which was a very significant move for me professionally and personally. It was the first time I could develop within an institution a sustained project that would be implemented over a number of years. I was also settling in the United States for a longer period of time, a country whose history and culture has always deeply intrigued me. Culture, context, and history is something I think about a lot, and it's important for me that my exhibitions in some way respond to the broader sites in which they are located. In this sense, I really think of the exhibition as an anthropological endeavor as well. I was already thinking about the relationship between literature, artwork, and exhibitions, or the relationship I could develop between the three. In 2006, when I was director of exhibitions at the Institute for Contemporary Arts in London, I'd organized an exhibition based on Jules Verne's novel Around the World in 80 Days, which was shown simultaneously at the IC and the South London Gallery. The exhibition included artists such as Mark Kamil Chaminowicz, Mona Hatoum, Runa Islam, Rosalind Nashashibi, and Yinka Shonibare, who were all born abroad and were now based in London. The exhibition included both existing works and new commissions based on the premise of the novel, which was very much influenced by a new sense of internationalism and a nascent globalization at the time it was written, 1873. Much of the work in the exhibition dealt with the question of cultural tourism, the aftermath of colonialization, migration, and race and politics. Early on in my directorship at the CCA Wattis, I decided that I wanted to repeat and expand upon the format initiated in London, which at that time I also conceived as a trilogy. Around the World in 80 Days was supposed to be followed by Through the Looking Glass and Peter Pan. Now here in San Francisco, my aim was to create a series of exhibitions devoted to exploring seminal works in American literature. The selection of the books came from both intellectual and personal criteria. I wanted to think about works of literature that had a particular richness and resonance in American culture and history that would be significant for me, the artist involved in the exhibition, and the audience. Each of the three shows had very distinct chapters and ways that they were structured, which later informed the structure of the exhibition. What connected The Wizard of Oz, Moby Dick, and Huckleberry Finn, in addition to the crucial place in the American literary canon and the larger public consciousness, are a number of elements that have a particular relationship to the making of exhibition. All three describe a journey. Be it Dorothy's trip along the yellow brick road, Ishmael's expedition on the Pacific Ocean, or Huck's and Jim's voyage down the Mississippi River. These journeys can be understood and indeed were intended by the authors to function as metaphors for human, intellectual, and emotional growth. Each exhibition was likewise designed as a journey with a clear point of departure and arrival. Conceive of an exhibition as a journey, as a passage through unknown territory makes particularly sense when one considers how artists, just like authors, try to explore places that are previously unknown, not only geographically, of course, but also artistically and intellectually. All three books relate to something archetypical and archetypically American: exploration, new frontiers, overcoming adversity. The Wizard of Oz is perhaps the most lighthearted of the three, but even that book was intended by its writer to serve as a political allegory, critiquing economical injustices prevalent in the early years of the 20th century, and it provoked serious debate at the time of its publication. Moby Dick, with a strong metaphysical, even supernatural bent in its multitudinous metaphors and references to philosophy, religion, and history, is definitely the most complex of the three books. And Huckleberry Finn was without a doubt the most provocative. All three shows contain historical artworks, a large number of newly commissioned works, and a significant body of material related to the author's life, their careers, and the books themselves. For instance, well-known illustrations from particular editions. The arrangement of all these elements was done with the intention of grounding the viewer in the original story and periodically reintroducing the book between experiences of looking at the new artworks by contemporary artists. An original edition of the book in question was situated at the entrance of each exhibition, where it would be the first piece encountered by the viewers. All three shows also examined the history and context surrounding the books via contemporaneous critical reviews and various film adaptations. In this sense, the exhibitions are extremely time-based. They are both based in history as well as in the contemporary moment, and their juxtaposition between the two engenders a particular dynamic within the exhibition space. To take a step back, as I mentioned before, I decided to start this series in the fall of 2008 with L. Frank Baum's The Wizard of Oz, which I think of as a first truly American fairy tale. The subjects it touches upon remain relevant to how we understand America and how we Americans understand themselves. Childhood, friendship, fairies, mortality, machines, wishes, desires, love, magic, illusion, good and evil, home, displacement, and utopia are only a few of the concerns written between the lines of this book. In the exhibition, artworks and artists become characters, each with an individual story to tell. Turning away from our immediate world and entering the sphere of imagination, the artworks in this exhibition allow us to see behind the curtain of reality, revealing it as a human-made and subjective. The decision to use Baum's book as a starting point for an exhibition stems from a wish to understand and reflect America's history and its current realities. In the exhibition, the connections between the artworks and the books vary in nature. Some of the participating artists have had a long affection for the story, and others addressed its theme and characters directly, while others worked more with the general ideas that the novel and film unraveled. And I'm just going to show you a few slides here from those exhibitions to give you a sense of the installation. Also essential to the structure of the exhibition is the inclusion of historical artifacts and memorabilia. Visitors encountered a rare first edition of the book and copies of all the other Oz books written by Baum, several of W.W. Denslow's original illustrations, the rarely seen first film based on the novel made in 1910, a pair of the original legendary ruby slippers from the 1939 movie, the unforgettable Somewhere Over the Rainbow soundtrack, and a number of film stills, which were displayed just as one would place family portraits on a desk or above a fireplace. And you wonder perhaps what the the portions in the space are that are colored here. And the way the structure of the exhibition worked was that the artifacts were presented on colored walls that would follow the colors of Dorothy's journey as Denslow laid them out in the original edition. Kansas, which you just saw, was gray, Munchkin Country was blue, the Emerald City green, Winky Country was yellow, and finally Quadling Country, which was red. The juxtaposition of artifacts and artworks not only acknowledges the enormous universe this story has opened up in popular culture, but it also provokes this sense of estrangement I introduced earlier. It turns viewers into a critical observer who are quite deliberately guided through the galleries and continually brought back from the artworks to Baum's stories. The exhibition does not seek to simulate the book, but to create something new from the material of Oz. It actually embodies rather than refers to its subject. Its straightforward structure and attention to detail in the installation, its design and text are intended to be self-reflexive and transparent. The second exhibition in the trilogy was based off a more markedly complex novel, Moby Dick, which took place in 2009. To fully comprehend Herman Melville's epic story would require diving impossibly deep. The book is about many more things than its narrator Ishmael, or than we as readers could ever entirely grasp. To understand Melville's sea of life requires resisting the temptation to narrow Moby Dick down to a single political or metaphysical narrative. Brutal tyranny, humans' obsessions, the romance of the sea, or, and worst and most reductive, to view it as a simple hunting adventure tale. Although these are certainly important elements to the story to explore the full breadth of Melville's masterpiece, we had to also embrace its artistic beauty, its poetics, and at that time, excessive language and its deliberate open-ended universality. Moby Dick is universal, daunting, and immense, and challenging to translate into an exhibition. The artworks were, of course, essential to the presentation at the Wattis, but equally important was the form in which the story was told. The show's overarching structure was inspired by the 1933-volume Lakeside Press edition of Moby Dick, which you see here, as well as a narrative arc of a classic three-act play. Act 1 was called Loomings, and it was the exposition introducing us to the protagonist and outlining the dramatic premise. The artworks in this gallery related to the preparations for a trip, focusing on ships, the iconic figure of the sailor, and the romantic notion of the sea as perceived from the safe and stable position of land. Oh, here you see Orson Welles reading from Moby Dick, and by that actually becoming the narrator of the story. At three particular points in the exhibition, you come across Orson Welles reading from the book, and it sort of becomes a guide and performer that takes you through the exhibition. Act 2. The Pacific took us out into the ocean. The mood in this gallery was darker and increasingly mysterious. Act 2 is also the moment when Ahab appears. Each gallery and each act of the exhibition was devoted to one particular character of the novel. First one was Ishmael. This is the introduction. Ahab, and then finally Moby Dick. The last act, Act 3, the chase, contained the final and dramatic encounter with the whale. Here we see a painting by Marcel Zama, which the viewer would encounter as soon as they came into the second floor gallery of the Wattis. A sort of short moment of calm and a return to the state of balance. In addition, each of the acts' gallery spaces brought together original illustrations that you see here connected to the main characters. Together, all of these components reflect many of the novel's most important themes and issues: religion and faith, obsession, death, defeat, race, class, and social status, friendship, homosexuality, absurdity, utopias, and of course humanity. In a similar vein to The Wizard of Oz, while some artworks illustrated particular scenes and characters from the book, others were open to more universal interpretation. All had connections to the story, but all functioned as individual artworks. Together, they created an open-ended, occasionally romantic, sometimes mysterious reading of Melville's enormous tale that could be entered from various points and points of view. They enable visitors to immerse themselves while simultaneously acknowledging that it is ultimately impossible to encompass fully all aspects of this complex novel. Here is The Whale itself, a work by Adrián Villarrojas from Buenos Aires. And the final dot of Moby Dick, a work by Chris Martin, Paulina Orlowska. Just a few more views of this exhibition. This is one of my favorites, Andreas Lominski. Here's a whole set of artifacts from the Maritime Museum in San Francisco, original whaling harpoons, as well as lithographs of whaling scenes in Scrimshaw, and a whole set of the original illustrations. And these 4 illustrations were done by Rockwell Kent, but not used for the 1930 edition. To reflect the all-encompassing nature of the book, it seemed crucial to move beyond the concept of a display purely focused on artworks, as I already said, and to integrate elements of history, anthropology, and the larger sphere of cultural production. In 2010, I concluded the trilogy with Huckleberry Finn, the most political and controversial of the three exhibitions. As the distillation of the issues raised by an iconic piece of literature via artifacts, films, older artworks, and a large number of newly commissioned pieces, Huckleberry Finn had much more in common in terms of its approach with the previous exhibitions, but it was different in some significant way. It put a stronger emphasis on the author, Mark Twain, for one, and also was specifically even vehemently organized to revolve around one character, Jim. With that gesture to put the focus of the show on one subject, race, instead of encouraging a more open consideration of a multitude of issues and narratives deriving from the book. Jim's struggles for liberty mirrors such an archetypical desire to be free, a wish shared by every human, that focusing on this aspect seemed the only possible way to look at Twain's masterpiece. The specific strategy of using an examination of the past to talk about the present, used in all three exhibitions, was actually inspired by Twain's authorial strategy in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and thus became more explicit in this particular show. Twain's overt statement at the outset of his novel that he was setting his plot during an earlier historical period planted the idea for what provided to be an interesting and complex curatorial approach. Twain wrote his story between 1876 and 1883 and published it in 1985. It is set sometime between 1835 and 1845, 2 or 3 decades before the Emancipation Proclamation and the end of the Civil War. It becomes clear to the reader very quickly that Twain's main objective is to speak about racism in the South, looking more generally at the moral confusion surrounding racism, discrimination, and intolerance. But the book and the show then expressed a desire to understand current American realities by looking at some of the troubling, controversial, and decisive moments in the country's history and their impact on the formation of American identity. The exhibition, like Twain's book, invited the viewer to think about where we stand in the face of racism and other forms of discrimination, intolerance, exploitation, and suppression in the United States and around the globe. Taking literature as a point of departure for the making of exhibitions carries the implication of the curator as author, who, over the course of several shows, presents a larger argument or a group of arguments. It is a creative form of exhibition making, but no less rigorous than the art historical methodologies of a more traditional curator. These three exhibitions were not specifically about the history of art or the history of literature, but rather they used art and literature as devices to look at human history in an almost anthropological fashion. With these exhibitions, I became a kind of narrator or storyteller, translating the narrative of a book into the narrative of an exhibition and turning the viewer into a reader. Here's the first edition, the first foreign translation, which was published in Sweden. The entrance room with the original typewriter Twain wrote the novel on, and a couple of installation shots. And this is the upstairs gallery. The raft, another raft. These are sort of historical artifacts. These particular ones sort of related to the history of the civil rights movement, and these are more related to the time of slavery, sort of wanted posters of runaway slaves, runaway slave coins, and a lithograph of a lynching. This is Huckleberry Finn condensed, when the artist Kirsten Pierrot took one of the paperback editions and cooked it for 2 days. Yinka Shonibara made these kites. Now that I've outlined the exhibition trilogy and given you some insight into my thoughts and work, I wanted to get back to this idea of performance and curating, or more generally, performance within the exhibition space. How are we doing with time? 9 minutes. Well, I have to read very fast. Perhaps right now, some of you are more familiar with my work, may be wondering why I choose to speak about these exhibitions, since my background is in theater. And And this idea of the exhibition as a dramatic construction might not be what you have expected. I will say that a lot of my involvement with performance occurred early on in my career, before much discussion had taken place on the subject and before the advent of performer in many of the performance departments in various museums. In 2001, I organized an exhibition titled A Little Bit of History Repeated at the Kunstwerke Institute for Contemporary Art in Berlin. The premise behind the exhibition was to invite a number of artists to revisit or re-perform important performances from the 1960s and 70s. Some of these artists invited were John Borg, Tanya Bugera, Trisha Donnelly, Evelyn Draxler, Tracy Rose, and Tino Sehgal. The performance took place on 2 consecutive evenings. The second evening was actually a repeat of the first. And the third day was oriented around a panel discussion that evaluated the project. Following the exhibition, a number of students working with Marina Abramovic would enact a series of performances developed in a seminar led by Marina and myself. In 2005, I also co-edited a book overviewing performance as a genre with John Jonas, published by Thames and Hudson. Additionally, as we heard in the introduction, I was an early supporter of Tino Sehgal's work and have organized a number of projects with him at the ICE in London and at the Wattis. In this sense, you could say I've certainly been involved at the growing conversation around performance and visual art. At the same time, I feel that at this point I do not identify with many of the developments happening in the field around performance. This is due part to my evolving interest and maybe also the maturation of my work, but I'm also generally not excited by some of the recent major exhibitions developed around performance, and I don't think they necessarily make a contribution to the curatorial field. I think they have perhaps been developed for reasons other than exploration of artistic or curatorial innovation that has more to do with fitting into a new ideal of the inclusive museum rather than any other imperative. It's of course not the purpose of my lecture to distinguish my practice in opposition to those trends, first of all because I don't necessarily think that binary oppositions are never really true, and second because it might be counterproductive. I would rather like to consider my practice on its own terms and with its own influences and predecessors as I just described. I do think I should elaborate on what I said, however, in order not to leave these criticisms hanging without substantiation and to perhaps show how different my exhibitions are from other ones out there. I will take 2 exhibitions as examples. They are both retrospectives of artists I just mentioned, Tino Sehgal and Marina Abramovic. Tino Sehgal had a major solo show at the Guggenheim Museum in early 2010, right around the same time of Marina Abramovic's retrospective, The Artist is Present at MoMA. Both exhibitions presented similar tropes for how performance in the museum is regularly presented and understood. The museum is laid bare of objects for the most part, giving visual primacy to its awe-inspiring spectacular architecture as well as to the bodies of the performers. Maintaining the form of the white cube is really essential to this kind of experience. It is a sterilization of space that ensures that the only sensory experience that takes place is the decontextualized one between viewer, performer, and architecture. Text and interpretive materials are minimal, and the setup of the space creates an extremely difficult environment for entering through a particular vantage point. This can make the entry point for audience experience, in my opinion, one of observation rather than initiation, and leads to passive consumption rather than to activation of imagination. I feel, though, that these 2 shows had different goals in mind that I have, of course, with my own exhibitions. The point of the Sehgal and Abramovic exhibition, in my opinion, was to create blockbusters that would generate crowds and publicity for the institution. The exhibitions did not necessarily do service to the work of the artists themselves, nor to the audience experience. For me, both exhibitions, but especially the Abramovic retrospective, were about the creation of celebrity. 5 minutes. The spectacle of architecture and the canonization of performance within the museum. The shows glossed the surface of an understanding of performance, but there was no real investigation of a practice. Rather, they were both congratulatory exercises, congratulatory to the artist and to the museums, which so progressively opened their doors to that kind of practice in which the audience could interact in various ways with the artist or the work. But interaction does not necessarily connote a real engagement. But I don't want to criticize my curatorial colleagues too much here, because I do not feel at the end of the day that each curator has to work within a particular set of parameters. The institution and the space demands. These major institutions have to work on a large scale, and thus these projects almost must necessarily engender a mass appeal only gained through celebrity and spectacle. At the same time, I can say this is not of interest of mine to work on such large scale. Again, the creation of subjectivity is most interesting for me, and for that I need to work within a more intimate, individualized environment. I think that exhibitions are a great tool for education because they allow every medium to be presented, whether that is literature, film, performance, and so on, but also elements from cultural history, as you have seen. I strongly believe in the idea of the total artworks towards total education. This was my challenge and attempt with the trilogy of exhibition, but also what I believe is a central concept and methodologies around my practice to date. Thank you very much. Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Jens. That's very rich, provocative. I think we'll have a lot to talk about. I have organized a kind of a question in a couple of parts, but I'm sure there'll be many questions from the House, and we'll move along to open it out as quickly as possible. I think it was great to remind us of the not nowness, really, of performance, to give us, like Sabina did on the first evening of this conference, of the rich history behind performance, being, around intermediality, but artists engaging with performance as well. And I thought your point was very well taken in that regard. I'm also kind of excited that here theater in relation to an exhibition doesn't mean necessarily live bodies or live art, but it's another way of thinking about another lineage that doesn't get us into always only the live. So I find that really rich. So throughout, I think display or staging is really your point. You say, and I'm working from the draft I was lucky enough to get in advance, that thank you for sending it to me so that I can respond. But if it's slightly different, if you've edited it, then you'll forgive me. You said, quote, "My point is that what we're talking about when we talk about visual arts and performance is not a new phenomenon within artistic practice itself. Rather, it's a development within display, collection, categorization, and institutionalization within the contemporary art world." So the mode of display and staging is really key here, and you're invested, it seems to me, in one that can enable a kind of critical thinking a la Brecht and Piscator, as opposed to a kind that Brecht would call culinary. You use the word sterilization at one point, you use the word passive consumption at another, or the sort of generation of an uncritical kind of fantasy experience. No, you're more interested in this category, Brechtian category of critical thinking, even though you don't say that you're a political curator. The politics might happen then perhaps in some kind of an experience. There's a parsing of experiences, critical experience and a fantastical one, or phantasmagorical one. So you prefer this Brechtian Piscatorian criticality and imagine yourself a storyteller as a curator, quote unquote, that's your word, storyteller, for telling a critical story that the other word you use is translates. And this translation aligns with politics for you. And you place text in a precise relationship to that criticality. And I'm very interested in this use of text as a word throughout here, and want to ask you some questions about that. For instance, at one point you refer to your exhibition practice as anthropological, and it might be interesting to hear more from you on that and about the stakes in that. You write, quote, "These three exhibitions," meaning the ones culled from the books, it was great to see those images. I'm sorry I didn't experience it in person. You write, quote, "These three exhibitions were not specifically about the history of art or the history of literature, but rather they used art and literature as devices," interesting word, "to look at human history in an almost anthropological fashion. With these exhibitions, I became a kind of narrator or storyteller, translating the narrative of a book into the narrative of an exhibition and turning the viewer into a reader," end quote. So intermediality is not really the issue here. We're comfortable with intermediality. The issue is the umbrella that contains your intermedial storytelling. And for you here, that umbrella is, quote, almost anthropology, end quote. Of course, I'm interested in the category almost here, as well as this presence of anthropology as a term, because looking through the images, I was thinking of not just art museum, but something like the Trocadero or something like a history museum or museum of natural history, and this kind of intermuseality became interesting to me. So maybe we can talk about that. So here's this turn to anthropology, and here this is specifically an anthropology that considers that culture can be read, a la Clifford Geertz. That is, you're, quote, turning the viewer into a reader. And I'm just curious, why reading? You know, what is this sort of thing about reading now and textuality? And of course, it reminds me of really huge debates within performance studies about the relationship between performance on the one side and textuality, the privileged place of textuality on the other. And I'm wondering how that debate is playing out in the museum. I find this interesting because this is a moment when the current, in many museums, including history museums, of course, is an attempt to generate an event that can be experienced, perhaps versus read. So this experiential turn, and you know, people have been talking about the performative turn, but many have argued that that performative turn has already been superseded by the affective turn, and the production of affect has kind of taken over from the production of performance, and it might be another useful thing for the collective to think about our relationship to those terms, our labor under those two terms, performance on the one side and affect on the other. Another example of your use of the lack of text as evidence of acriticality is when you were critical of Abramovic and Sehgal exhibitions, particularly The Artist is Present, because of the staging. And you wrote, quote, "The museum is laid bare of objects, for the most part, giving visual primacy to its awe-inspiring, spectacular architecture, as well as the bodies of the performers. Maintaining the form of a white cube is really essential to this kind of experience. It is a sterilization of space that ensures that the only sensory experience that takes place is a decontextualized one. Text and interpretive materials are minimal, and the setup for this space," and you go on, but this issue of text being minimal is something that kind of affords this problem of experience for you, this other kind of experience, I think. So I'm interested in your investment in text as you articulate it in relation to a concomitant sort of dismissal of performance in the museum, or the work that performance can do in the museum. You say, quote, "I do not identify with many of the developments happening in the field around performance. I don't think they necessarily make a contribution to the curatorial field." So I'm very interested in this. I'm also a member of the Piscator Appreciation Club. And I'm eager to know what you think. Placing text in distinction to performance has a long history, as I said, in theater studies, of course, despite the fact that in mainstream theater, text, as in the play text, is always the privileged partner in production. Panic about performance in the archive, and I say archive here rather than museum, if we want to talk about that further, I'm happy to. Panic about performance in the archive has usually not been about displacing text. But in the theater, the panic about performance is about displacing text. So there are different panics relative to performance. The art world has panicked about the displacement of the object. The theater world has panicked about the displacement of text. So I really do see you with this particular panic as a theater artist in an interesting way, and I think maybe we can start talking about our panics as a way of thinking about the ways we come together across our disciplines. Let's see. Yes, in the art museum, it's been more often about the displaced object, or issues of authenticity, issues of circulation and ownership, or perhaps even the relationship of the performance, if it's a reenactment of an acquired piece, to an original formerly understood primarily through photography. And I had more to say about that, but I think I'll stop. So basically, I thought the absence of text was interesting, especially as a problem for you, especially regards Sehgal, who, in your own work with Sehgal over time, perhaps you can answer, because of course, I mean, he's really quite radical in the non-use of text, which matches the non-use of photography, of the camera and text, and then, the absence of text goes so far as even to the absence of any document about the piece itself in its sale. So I just would like to know about the criticality in that as you see it, and whether we can find any sort of lineage to Brechtian thinking regarding that particular lack of text, at least at the level of Verfremdungseffekt. So I think that's a good place to stop, except I had one other question to throw at you about this affective turn and the emphasis on reading. Some of the works we saw in here last night, Ralph Lemon's piece, was so fantastic, and I wonder if reading is the best way to think about when Oakwey's Tears, for instance, is reading a way of engaging with Oakwey's Tears? What is our way of engaging affect? What are the stakes in our spectator position, our audience position, relative to the production of affect? I also wanted to remind us of the talk that the little bits of piece of work that we saw by Esther Schall of Goertz on the intervals of affect in the piece on the Holocaust survivors, where this is reading what we're meant to do in these pauses between narration that the artist highlights. So that's my question. I'm sure there are many more open from the floor, but thank you very much for an incredibly productive paper. Thank you. Do you want to come up? So I'll guide the questions.
I can guide. Why don't you go sit down and I'll...
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Thank you both, Jens and Becca, for starting us off this morning so beautifully. I wonder if questions are brewing from the floor. I mean, if not, I could start. Okay, go ahead, and then I'll jump in with mine. Remember, a microphone's coming your way. Thank you, Hente.
I was thinking about what you said about this in relation to theater, and it occurred to me that these three exhibitions could also be seen as adaptations in the way that screenwriters, filmmakers will adapt literary text to the screen, and this problem of detextualization to move it into something that is appropriately cinematic, and what is lost and what is gained in that. And very often the most faithful kinds of literary adaptations end up being the least successful films. And so I found this idea of adapting these books to the visual, it's fascinating and really extraordinarily productive. But the one thing that raised a question for me was actually the museum space itself, that whether or not this adaptation was being shoehorned into this space that in fact gave it a kind of literalism that in some ways reasserted the problem of its textuality, or couldn't take up certain aspects of the books in that way. And would this kind of adaptation also include a new kind of way of exhibiting it, or a new kind of context or space? And I was even thinking about Jean Finley's piece where they did this geocaching where spectators moved around an environment, outside of the museum or the theater and so on. So I'm just curious about this process and the way in which it might open on to even a different kind of adaptation that, that moves away in some sense from the museum or the gallery.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one of the things that perhaps are interesting to sort of like talk about is also something that in Germany, where I was educated in theater, particularly at the time in the 90s, was sort of like a theater that is called Volksbühne, and where there was a very particular type of theater existing, which in Germany is called Regietheater, which means basically that the sort of like really creative element there is really the particular form of directing. And I think really one of the main protagonists for this movement is someone like Frank Castorf. That was something very sort of like going a little bit into the direction that you were just talking about, with sort of like literary elements or even existing texts would be copied and pasted, cut up, almost sort of radically destroyed to a certain degree and filled up with other elements that somehow were related to, more sort of daily politics. It was sort of like an interesting sort of way of like how I felt like, there is something that's sort of like in a similar way using existing material to create a sort of almost another story or a story with a sort of different narrative. And it's true, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about what is a continuation of exhibitions like this? What can this lead to? And interestingly enough, of course, all of this happens within an institution or in a space that is designated as a contemporary art gallery. So what you find is sort of like a balance between, of like, 50-50 artifacts, historical material, and contemporary artworks. And that balance might shift from show to show, but it will never, in this kind of context, I think, be able to shift really dramatically more towards the inclusion of elements coming from cultural history or more sort of like anthropological approach, or as you said, even really become sort of like an exploration of display strategies that are used to from a natural or cultural history museum, of which I, of course, adopt a lot of elements. I mean, it is very deliberate that the exhibitions look like exhibitions of a cultural history museum. But but where is there a place for that? There is no place for that. Where would I bring that type of exhibition? It doesn't fit into the contemporary art world if I would be continuing with a sort of more radical approach in this direction, nor would it really exist or able to exist in the context of theater.
So this raises the question of limitations of institutionalization that are these these projects. Are they exceeding the limit of the institutions themselves? And since there are no other, are people thinking about the development of new kinds of sites and institutions outside of these, museums and galleries and so on? I mean,
where we can have some more Castorfian curatorship, which I think is so compelling. Jonah, and then Julia.
Jens, thank you for such an illuminating presentation, and Rebecca for the response. I was reflecting on non-narrative theatrical practice and innovation over the last 60 years, and how that might provide additional scaffolding for a narrative architecture for an exhibition. I was wondering if you could reflect on that.
Well, it's interesting that I would talk about the idea of this exhibition as a dramatic construction, even though I'm also very involved. Yeah, I was involved with what we would call like post-dramatic theater. Like a concept that the theater historian Hans T. Schliemann sort of created on the basis of more European avant-garde theater of the 80s, 90s. Really coming out of like a tradition of early 20th century avant-garde, then moving over to the United States, finding it sort of like as form here through artists like Czech now or the Wooster Group or Robert Wilson, Richard Foreman and things like that, or whatever followed that, and then sort of like making a turn back to Europe. But, you know, really in its core, thinking about post-dramatic theater would be to think about theater without a hierarchy, in which none of the elements that are usually associated with theater have, you know, are put in any hierarchy. The text is not privileged over the acting or the set design or the light or whatever else you have there as a element within theater, which sort of like goes back to what you were saying as, you know, a particular form of maybe more realist theater where you know, the text is really core. So I mean, in some way, these ideas of Lehmann from his book find their way here in these exhibitions again, kind of connected again also with Piscato's use of like many different mediums within one space, and a sort of like non-hierarchy between all of this. Even though you stressed the sort of the sort of focus on text and within all of that.
Well, the focus on the text was when the way in which you criticized the Abramovic and the Sehgal seemed to go around the lack of text in those exhibitions. So text became a kind of marker word for the literarization. I mean, that's Brecht's term, literarization, and historicization, his sort of two parts of his investment in the social jest. That you use the word text to stand in for those things that were missing. So that I think it was an expanded notion of text, but it's still privileged textuality. And certainly, so, yes.
Although, I mean, again, it can be text in the Brechtian or Piscatorian sense would be text as interruption, as a kind of graphic that stops time, actually, not necessarily text as this primary thing that preceded. You know, again, the referent for text in the different contexts turns out to really shift, and it's so relationally constructed, whether we're in a literature versus theater mode versus a visual art versus visual art versus...
But the anthropology mode, which you also referred to, then does assume a kind of outside looker, you know, who has a critical
over the
distance,
shoulder.
and distance too. I mean, Brecht's notion of literarization, being an interruption or footnote theater, provokes a distance for viewing. And that is interesting also, though, relative to other kinds of moments right now that have a sort of use of affect. Now, I think affect, which often can mean a collapse of distance, is also being used in contemporary work to interrupt.
Right.
But, you know, it's whether or not that then becomes, we read it, or there's another critical distantiation effect that can happen.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, I have no answer to that.
It depends on what it's interrupting.
Yeah.
So it even looks... Julia, go ahead. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. This is extremely compelling material. Jens, I wanted to, I have a question sort of by way of an anecdote, which is that I was a visiting scholar at CCA in fall of 2010, and so was teaching there, teaching a class on contemporary art, and the Huckleberry Finn show was up, and there was also simultaneously, as you well know, a Tino Sehgal retrospective. So in the space of lynching materials and runaway slave stuff, there were people kissing. You know, a few times there were a couple kissing, and it was an extreme collision. I thought that, I mean, that produced, I thought, an almost explosive tension about sort of, you know, context and form and sort of materials coming into contact, very provocative. And I had some students who refused. I'm just kind of interested in how you negotiate, you know, the location of the Wattis with its pedagogical mission as literally attached to an art school. You know, some of my students didn't want to, refuse to go to that gallery because of the inflammatory nature of some of the material. And it became a really interesting question of, you know, should I make them go, and or do I respect their opinion not to want to see that material, et cetera. So I just want to hear from you some thoughts about how you understand your curatorial vision as kind of embedded within this educational institution.
Wow, that's probably like material for a completely another big, longer conversation. And because, you know, as you say, the program at the Wattis is truly in its core guided around this idea that we have this very particular position within an arts college, which actually also, I think, is you know, it's an enormous privilege and at the same time challenge. But given sort of like my interest in education, I think it's was a perfect sort of fit for me. I don't know how much I want to go into the sort of like question of the more delicate or maybe more sort of controversial material in Huckleberry Finn. You know, it touched upon a very particular problem and which somehow still seems to upset a lot of people. And maybe I have a different approach to it, given that I have a very different sort of like cultural background and come sort of from a little bit of a different place, and that sort of like feeds back to this idea of the curator as anthropologist. We sort of like look at what is in front of you and have this critical distance to actually also deal with material that is perhaps more controversial in some way or the other. But if I may just like elaborate on one other sort of thing that maybe is interesting, because it's this whole notion of like the development of curating over the last 20 years, and how I see more and more curatorial work happening, let's say, outside of the gallery space, or less and less involved with actually working with artists, and where almost like the exhibition is constantly, or the curatorial process is what is so often reflected upon, and curatorial innovation seemed to mean that it can only be achieved by leaving the exhibition space behind, by leaving the medium of the exhibition behind. And a lot of the thinking that is coming at the conclusion into these exhibitions is the sort of idea of like, how can we actually look at the exhibition as a format, or the exhibition as a medium, as something that hasn't actually fully reached the potential it could have in terms of its ability to create meaning between what is actually exhibited, how is it exhibited, how is it interpreted, and how is all of that then sort of brought into a sort of dynamic situation with the viewer. But I like the idea of like the curator as the anthropologist. I'm amateur anthropologist, obviously.
Almost. Suzanne?
I want to be modest,
Thank you very much for the really interesting presentations and questions. What I was hearing evoked was sort of the difference between the two avant-garde traditions of Brecht and Artaud, and it seems to me that each of them can be recuperated in a either blockbuster or commodity fashion. And so I wanted to ask you to say a little bit more about what kind of criticality you were seeking, and just to throw out a third avant-garde tradition for the anthropologist would have been Bataille's document, which would lead one to wonder whether, in terms of getting away from the exhibition site, there wouldn't be new media opportunities for the anthropologist curator. So those are, I guess, two questions in one, but the primary question is what kind of critical reception, or what kind of criticality you were seeking in the audience as readers. So what kind of reader, and reader of what?
Well, I think that the Huckleberry Finn is probably sort of like an exhibition in which I could illustrate this in the best possible way. We were sort of focusing on the character of Jim, particularly to talk about race and issues of discrimination, exclusion, suppression, or possible, emancipation. And
Thinking more of the Wizard of Oz.
Oh, the Wizard of Oz. Well, an interesting thing with the Wizard of Oz is, of course, that there is this like one particular point that sort of like looks at the Wizard of Oz as a sort of political allegory of its time, and sort of like economical problems that occurred there, sort of evil landowners that are represented by the witches, or the sort of like dehumanized human worker that is represented by the Tin Man, all these sort of like little elements that sort of like exist there. And my reading of The Wizard of Oz, and that's sort of like a very personal sort of interpretation, of course, has sort of to do with the aftermath of colonialization, a sort of, reading that actually is also influenced by Salman Rushdie's little essay about The Wizard of Oz, and this idea of like how Dorothy is sort of like embodying this like very particular archetypical problem that a lot of us sort of carry around with them, this desire of actually, having this intellectual growth and wanting to go somewhere else and mature and all of that. And then at the other end, this sort of like longing for a place called home, which translates into sort of like this desire of tradition and maybe conservatism.
Follow up, I'm just wondering specifically what the artifactual contributes to the criticality.
And I'll just repeat, since she didn't have a microphone, what the artifactual contributes to this criticality.
So in terms of the structure of the exhibition, you saw these like different colored walls. They're used really sort of like a simple structural device that guides you through the show. You begin with the first wall, which is it's colored blue, and that wall contained the first edition of the book, a number of first editions of the other books Baum wrote on the Wizard of Oz, as well as the first review written in the New York Times in 1990 when the book came out. The next one is about the illustrations of the book. Then you go on, you have the famous blockbuster film, and so on and so forth. And the point for me was really to like insert these moments when you as a viewer might sort of like be too immersed in this situation and drag you back to the original story. Exactly. Moments, like really classic sort of moments of, using some sort of an estrangement effect, as Brecht would have called it. And those are sort of like elements that would come in again and again. The whole idea of using the display strategies as we know them from cultural history museums is exactly the same thing. That throws you off. Oh, I'm coming to like what's supposed to be like a really cutting-edge contemporary exhibition space, and you're confronted with glass vitrines, sort of bronze hats of Mark Twain, an old typewriter. But then when you look more carefully, all of a sudden there's a white suit, and it's a fake Mark Twain suit, but it actually has my measurements and was made like 3 weeks before the opening, so it's not the original one. So it's sort of like in this Mark Twainish way, of course, also plays with the expectations of the viewer or the reader.
Wonderful. I'm afraid that we're at our moment where we should be starting the next panel and have missed our break. So I'd ask you to hold on to your questions, and we'll have more opportunities throughout the rest of the day to participate in further Q&A. And I really want to thank Jens for, I think, further estranging the Making Time moniker, in part by reminding us and thinking deeply about literature, which hasn't been necessarily up until now a time-based art that we looked at, paradoxically, until now. So thank you, and thank you to Becca.
Thank you.